What comes first when it comes to the Pope is the declaration of Jesus risen from the dead. Nobody picked Bergoglio. Nobody. He would be continuity with Francis for sure, I think. I think he'd be a steady hand. He's an ultimate Vatican insider. I would say this, I wouldn't entirely mind a quiet papacy. Very sneaky smart, like you discover, boy, this guy knows a lot about a lot of things.
Is it time for an African Pope?
Why not? I think to put the stress on the spiritual, on the evangelical, on the declaration of Jesus, that's what matters.
Welcome to this interview with Bishop Barron, being hosted here on EWTN, but also on Word on Fire. Bishop, great to see you again.
Colm, always good to be with you.
How does it feel to be back in Rome under these circumstances?
Well, it's always good coming to Rome. I've been here many times, and I always enjoy it. These are odd circumstances in a way. This Interregnum, the sede vacante, is always kind of an unsettled time for the church. We're all a bit on pins and needles, I suppose, on tenterhooks. So, but it's always good to be here in Rome, and it's an exciting time, and lots going on. So good to be here.
I've been saying to people too, it feels like a little bit of a mix of emotions with the sadness and the sorrow of the past scene, the anticipation of what's to come, what could be. It's a mix of everything, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And of course, the last two, you had one is a funeral without a conclave, the other one a conclave without a funeral. And so we're kind of back to a normal. We have a funeral then a conclave is more the usual procedure. But right, that it stirs up a mix of feelings. And I tried to get to the grave of Pope Francis yesterday, and we just drove past.
Line too long.
Too long, yeah. So I'll try to get there at some point this week. But that's a beautiful tribute, to him.
Now I have to point out to people who are watching that you did get a bit of sun.
I did.
It wasn't the Bahamas or anywhere you were, it was the Rose Garden.
It was indeed, yeah, with President Trump when we had the inauguration of this Commission on Religious Liberty, and I was sitting with many others in the Rose Garden for about 3 hours in the hot sun. So maybe you see some effects of that. Yeah. My Irish skin doesn't do well in the hot sun.
That's the same, we don't take well to the sun.
No.
And this commission now that's been set up by the administration, what's the aim of it, or what do you hope to see come out of it?
Well, I got the invitation, from the White House to be part of a commission on religious liberty. And it's a major issue in our country. And for the bishops of America, for the past maybe 25 years, it's been a premier issue for us. Guaranteeing, the religious liberty, which is part of our Constitution, the First Amendment, but also very important to the church.
Could it put you in a difficult position, Bishop, being appointed by the President on a government-established commission? Would it make it difficult for you in the future to call out the government in places where it's wrong in the church, or knowledge gaps or things like that?
I don't think so. I mean, as I say, to be a Catholic voice around that table is very important. If it ever reached a point where I felt, I would have to compromise something of my own, beliefs, I'd resign from it. So no, I don't feel any obligation to say now I'm completely endorsing everything the Trump administration stands for. I just want to be a voice on this issue around the table.
The AI image that has been going viral, which was tweeted first by President Donald Trump on Truth Social, but then also shared by the official White House Twitter account, or an X, of President Donald Trump as the new Pope.
Right.
What did you think when you saw that?
Look, I think it was a bad joke. I think it was kind of a sophomoric attempt at humor. I don't think at all it represents some, disdain for the Catholic Church or some attack on the Catholic Church. President Trump has signaled in all sorts of ways his support for and affection for the Catholic Church. I think it was a bad joke that obviously landed very poorly and was seen as offensive by a lot of Catholics. And I wish he hadn't done it. That's my view on it.
Do you wish he would take it down?
All right, I'll leave it up to him. I mean, I think it's had something like 97 million views.
Wow,
or something.
so it's out there already at this point.
What would be the point?
But it's in poor taste.
I think so, yeah.
We're here in Rome for the conclave in just a few days' time. How important and significant is a time like this, not only in the history of the church, but in this moment for the entire world as well?
I think it's always important. I mean, the Pope, say what you want, the Pope is the most visible and I think important religious leader in the world. And so it's important not just for the 1.4 billion Catholics, but I think really for everyone around the world. The Pope plays a very important role politically, culturally. Obviously, he gets the attention of the world. Look at this place right now. So sure, I think appropriately the whole world comes to attention. I always think, of the Lord's command to preach to all nations. Peter, the first Pope, comes here precisely because he knew this was the center of civilization. And indeed, the word went out from here to the whole world. So it's kind of appropriate and strangely almost mystical, isn't it? That still the whole world is deeply attentive to the election of the successor of Peter.
Yeah, and when you mention the whole world watching, it does feel like Rome is the center of the universe at the moment, because what people can see off camera is that EWTN here, of course, Word on Fire, but you have all the secular networks from every corner of the planet who have gathered here to cover this. I think
it's beautiful, yeah.
Is it fair to say, with social media, with the recent interest because of the movies and the TV shows, this is probably one of the most closely watched conclaves in history?
Absolutely. I remember I was here 12 years ago doing coverage for the last conclave, and the image in my mind is the night when Pope Francis came out on the balcony, and then you look out at the sea of the people, but this time all the lights from the
TV networks.
Well, they're not just TV, of the little eye cameras and
iPhones, yeah.
And it was just like the votive lights, you know. I thought, well, it's a revolution now in social media, even more so now.
I saw yesterday on social media you posted a video saying that you were sick and tired of the commentary around this, or bits of it were annoying you. What were you talking about?
Well, the politicization of it. Now look, there's the gospel. There are indeed moral implications of the gospel, and then there are indeed kind of political strategies that are meant to embody moral principles. I get that relationship. You can't divorce the church from politics in that sense. But what gets me is the lack of proper prioritization. What comes first when it comes to the Pope is the declaration of Jesus risen from the dead. It was Gerald O'Collins, the great theologian for many years, the Gregorian. He said this must have been 2005, I think, when John Paul II died. And they're all asking, what are you looking for? What are you looking for in a Pope? And there's all the usual answers. He said, I want someone who declares the resurrection of Jesus in a compelling way. Because that was Peter's job, and this successor of Peter. I think to put the stress on the spiritual, on the evangelical, on the declaration of Jesus, that's what matters. Now, as I say, indeed, there are further implications from that. But the preoccupation with, is he left wing, is he right wing, climate change, immigration, okay, we can get to all that. But the first thing I'd look for is a disciple, a believer in Jesus, and who has the capacity to proclaim the resurrection in a compelling way. That's the Pope's job, and thereby to be a source of unity for the church. But see, people tend to overlook that, when they're looking at the qualifications of the Pope.
Yeah, they look at the issues of today and just see where their strengths and weaknesses.
It's seeing it relentlessly through a secular political lens. And again, I get it, but I'm annoyed at the way it gets the priorities off.
Okay. Let's talk about some of the cardinals. Now, the famous saying here, he who goes in a pope comes back out a cardinal.
Right.
And some of these names are being passed around as contenders, others possibly not. But we have to point out that in the last conclave, Bergoglio was I think number 15 as the bookies' favorites at the time.
I can tell you, again, 12 years ago when I was here, and I met with a lot of the pundits and everyone commenting, nobody picked Bergoglio. Nobody. Yeah. I remember I was with NBC last time and we had all the pictures of the candidates. Bergoglio was not one of them. So I always put that forward as a caution whenever we're talking about candidates. And there's certainly a good chance it won't be any of these people, So,
and we hope the Holy Spirit will be doing its job and
Holy Spirit is guiding
these men, of course. Well, you spoke about when you were on television, they put the faces up on screen, and they've been doing that again this time.
Yeah.
And the number one face that keeps coming up on all the networks, and I think he is, if you're going in to put money down in the bookies, that Pietro Parolin, the current Secretary of State.
Yeah.
When you look at someone like him, his vast experience as a diplomat here at the Vatican, being so close to Pope Francis throughout his pontificate, what kind of pontificate would you see under Parolin?
I think he'd be a steady hand. He's an ultimate Vatican insider. As you say, he's been number 2 man in the Vatican for all these years. Lots of experience around the world, plugged into a lot of different scenarios. The cardinals and bishops know him very well. That's the key thing. I think when Ratzinger was elected, that was a main reason why. He was a Vatican insider. All the cardinals
spoke all their languages.
Right, and Parolin's got all of that. I came to know a number of these people. I was at the Synod here the last 2 rounds, the last 2 Octobers. And I think there were 60 cardinals at the Synod. And very often I would say, there's a pretty good chance the next Pope is one of these fellows, So Parolin was certainly there. And he is kind of a calm, steady presence, not a flashy, not a sort of charismatic figure. Yeah. I would see him as kind of the steady hand on the tiller sort of person. The negative would probably be the China deal.
China-Vatican
that
deal.
A lot of us, I include myself, have hesitations about. Many of us feel that there's a little too much concession to the Chinese Communist Party.
And China have broke the deal on a number of occasions.
So that, could be a drawback. I don't think he'd be a flashy, sort of public, charismatic pope.
Yeah. And how important do you think that is after a papacy of Francis, where he did have that charisma all over the world, and while he may not have been able to speak the local languages, he knew the moments and the gestures, when to tap the driver to stop the Pope Mobile, embrace someone with special needs, when to wash their feet, when to embrace someone with disabilities. He just, that charisma transcended boundaries and even faiths and people of no faith as well.
And it's important. I wouldn't want to, undersell that as just kind of a cosmetic thing. I think that's a very important part of the papacy. It's the ultimate bully pulpit. And so people like John Paul II, who had a strong sense of theatricality about him, understood that. And yes, Francis did too. So I wouldn't underplay that. That's important consideration.
Now, another name that has been touted as one of the favorites is from Manila in the Philippines, Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle, someone who is seen as having maybe that charisma as well. I know they called him the Asian Pope Francis, Pope Francis 2.0, whatever. And what would you think of a papacy under Tagle?
Well, he's a very charming man. I probably maybe know him the best of all the names that have been bandied about. I first met him in the Philippines. It was Eucharistic Congress 2016 in Cebu. And I met him there. And, he's just a charming, he's very funny. He was at the last 3 synods, as I was too, the Youth Synod and the 2 on synodality. The Youth Synod, I was with him in our small language group and got to know him there pretty well. He would, as you say, have the charisma in great supply, and he would be able to communicate the gospel through gesture and through humor. Is intelligent man, but very emotional man too.
You're very emotional.
We used to smile about it, but very often his speeches would end with his weeping.
Yeah, I was going to say he would get teary in interviews.
He would get teary. Yeah. So very emotional man. He would belong to the school that reads Vatican II more as a rupture than continuity, the famous Bologna school. He would be in that group. So in that way, probably lean further left than, let's say the John Paul II model. He would be strong on the public, charismatic side of the papacy. He would be continuity with Francis for sure, I think. And if the Cardinals are looking for a little change of direction, they might not go with him.
Okay. It's funny when you said, leaning a little bit more left. I know there's another saying here in Italy, you have a fat pope, you have a skinny pope.
Yeah, right.
Fat, you go conservative, you go liberal, conservative, liberal. After Pope Francis seen as being a more liberal papacy, do you think there's an appetite, certainly from a lot of young people I've been speaking to here in the square, about what they want next? I've heard a few times, even from people from Germany as well, parts of Europe, I would love to see a bit of a return to tradition and the beauty, and clarity on the teachings.
Yes, and there's something that's natural and good about that. I mean, we tend to live in this world of polarities, and one person will be stronger here. So, okay, there's a natural instinct for the correction. That's the skinny pope, fat pope thing, which is not entirely wrong-headed. Yeah. As you go into a conclave, think, okay, we've been walking this way, maybe we need to correct direction a bit. So I get that. I would say this, I wouldn't entirely mind a quiet papacy. I go back to John Henry Newman. I'm very indebted to Newman. Yeah. And Newman felt that the Pope's job is to adjudicate disputes. The life of the church goes on, liturgically, theologically, and its social service to the poor and all that. And the Pope is there kind of quietly to adjudicate disputes when they come to him. His job for Newman was not to be so involved in everything himself. It was to let the church live, and he would adjudicate the way an umpire or a referee might. I wouldn't entirely mind maybe a quieter
something
papacy.
A bit more low-key.
Yeah, that sort of allows the life of the church to unfold, but plays that role of unifier and adjudicator of disputes. So that might be a corrective.
It's funny you say that, because a few weeks ago I was in Buenos Aires before the Holy Father passed away, and we were making a documentary about the early life and the legacy of Jorge Mario Bergoglio before he became Pope Francis. And because he was seen as such a disruptor in one sense when he became Pope, someone there told me, they said, we have a phrase here in Latin America that Pope Francis was the first Latin American Pope and also the last Latin American Pope.
Well, they said the same thing about John Paul II and the Polish Pope, but so that's the way it goes. I think there's a natural instinct for the corrective maybe, and that's okay.
Africa, the continent of Africa. When we look at, let's say, for example, the top 10 practicing countries for Catholicism, like going to Mass, going in for a religious life, most of those countries are now in the continent of Africa or in Asia. Is it time for an African Pope?
Why not? At the Synod, I said this at both rounds of the Synod on Synodality many times. I said it in private conversation, I said it at the tables. I think I might have said it once to the whole plenary. I said, the church is flourishing most right now in Nigeria, where something like 94% of Catholics go to Mass, where the seminaries are bursting. It's a church under persecution, yet showing great strength. I said many times, why are we so preoccupied with the church in Germany, where the church is kind of withering on the vine? Why don't we study the Nigerian church and see what they're doing right, and let's imitate it? So yes, I think it might be the African moment, and I do think in the synods during the Francis years, the Africans found their voice in a fresh way.
Really?
No question about that. I think going back to the synods on the family, and then on young people, and on synodality, I think the African voice, and then of course famously with Fiducia Supplicans, in the wake of the first round of the synod on synodality, where I must say, we never talked about that issue. There were 400 people in the Paul VI audience hall, bishops, cardinals, leaders of the church. We never talked about it. And then about a month later, out comes this statement, and I think the African bishops said, look, this is not going to fly. I think they found their voice in an important way. So why not an African pope? Sure.
Yeah. I remember interviewing the Bishop of Nairobi, and he said, we have a crisis of vocations like you. And I said, what? He said, no, but our crisis is we have too many, and not enough space.
Seminaries
to put them,
quick enough, right.
But do you think it would be reflected in this conclave, or would be future ones? Because people still, when I was on a TV network the other night, this obsession, again, focusing on Germany or the United States, and I was asked about, but the traditional side or the conservative side of the Catholic Church in America, and I said, you have to forget that, as if it's a fringe group in the US. I said, you go across the southern hemisphere, and the African countries, they're traditional countries with traditional values. They want to see that reflected in the church, supported and promoted by the Catholic Church.
Well, I go back to an earlier part of our conversation. I think when you stress the supernatural element first. Now, Thomas Aquinas, grace builds on nature, and there's not a hostility between the supernatural and the natural, but the supernatural comes first. The supernatural has priority, and then the natural is raised up into the supernatural by the supernatural. When churches emphasize the supernatural dimension of the faith, they thrive. They thrive. And the paradox is, they become more effective in the world. They become a more effective voice and agent for change in the world. The primary concern should be God, the Trinity, Jesus, crucified, risen from the dead, offering grace for salvation. That should be our focus. That's when Peter and Paul came to this city. That's what was on their mind.
Looking at the continent of Africa, who would you look at as a serious contender, or someone you think would be great in the papacy?
Well, Cardinal Sarah, he's on the older side now. Is he 79 maybe, or 78? Although, look, Ratzinger was elected at 78, wasn't he? Bergoglio at 76. But Cardinal Sarah is someone I've admired for a long time. I've loved his books. I think he's a very
great intellect,
spiritually alert man, let's put it that way, and a good writer, and someone that understands, the essential elements of the church's life. So, I think he's a strong character. Cardinal Buzungu, who led that charge after Fiducia Supplicans and kind of united the African leadership, and also deftly handled some diplomatic situations, coming here and talking to Cardinal Fernandez and talking to the Pope. And I think he showed a lot of moxie and a lot of practical ability, as well as clarity of vision. Cardinal Turkson's been around for a long time. He's been a candidate the last, maybe 2 conclaves. A substantial man, a lot of jobs here in Rome. I was with him at a conference about a year ago on Thomas Aquinas, and I gave a paper at that. And Turkson sort of ran things. And I remember the morning of the conference, we were there at a little coffee shop in Fostanova, where Thomas Aquinas died. That's where the conference was. And very quietly, Cardinal Turkson went over and he just ordered coffees for everybody and then served us our coffee. So I said to him, now I hope you're the next Pope, so I can say I was served coffee by the Pope. I was impressed by his kind of simplicity and his goodness.
From Ghana,
Ghana, and he's been a candidate for a while, could still be.
If we bring it back to Europe for a while, I know that some of the other, again, front runners, according to the media and the bookies and all that, and we've just said, of course, how wrong they can be, but 2 Italian names, Cardinal Zuppi, but also Cardinal Pizzaballa, the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, vast, experience and knowledge in the Middle East. They're 35 years plus or something in the Holy Land. And what a job at hand he has at the moment. What would you think of someone like Cardinal Pizzaballa?
Impressive man, by all accounts. He's a Franciscan. He's got a strong spiritual foundation. He's a Bible man, studied in Jerusalem. He's been in Jerusalem all these years, so he's a man of the Holy Land, of Scriptures. And then, as everyone has said, I think correctly, he's navigated some pretty choppy waters in the Middle East and getting people around the table and to talk to each other and showing a very deft hand. So that's impressive, for the diplomatic demand of the papacy. He's got the languages as a Bible scholar. He'd have
too young, perhaps.
Well, and that would be the thing, and I that's worthy of consideration, because let's face it, with modern medicine, people are living much longer.
You could have a 30-year
right
plus papacy,
and I think they are aware of that. If you elect a 60-year-old man, right, he could be pope for 25 or longer years. So I wonder if people might be thinking next time around, in 10 years or 12 years. Again, who knows? But I wonder if that might be an instinct with Pizzaballa. Next time around, he might be a better candidate.
And I know that was one of the things that was discussed in the pre-conclave congregations. And I think that gives you a good idea of the kind of themes and issues that might be driving this conclave. Age was one, greater unity. They also talked about financial transparency, getting a better handle on the finances as well.
I remember I had the privilege of living with Cardinal George of Chicago for about 5 or 6 years. And he was at the last conclave. And when he got back from the conclave, he said, we've elected someone who ran a big diocese, he knows finances, and he's going to clean up the finances of the Vatican. So that was foremost on Cardinal George's mind when they elected Pope Francis 12 years ago. And I think there's still a problem with the finances here. And so someone with some skill in that area, maybe not a big Mr. outside, but more of a Mr. inside that can manage a bureaucracy and manage the finances, wouldn't be my strong suit. And I don't know, but a lot of these cardinals, if that's what they're particularly good at.
Mammoth task.
Mammoth task, right. But, I think they've identified that as a serious problem.
You mentioned your home country of the United States. Any serious contenders from the US? And again, I keep prefacing by saying we don't know when we say this, but...
My basic answer is no, only because I think it's very unlikely an American would be elected Pope. I think there's...
Why do you say that?
Well, because we're the superpower in the world. And so people would say, look, you run politics, you run the economy, you tend to run popular entertainment, you're going to run the church too.
Yeah.
I remember Cardinal George often said that. He said, there will not be an American Pope until we go into political decline. Now he always took the broad view. We will go into political declines, and maybe it's in 1,000 years or 500 years, who knows. But he said, as long as we're the leading superpower, it's unlikely. And I think that's probably right. Having said that, Cardinal Prevost, many have mentioned, the prefect for the dicastery for bishops, which is a very high-profile position, puts him in contact with bishops all over the world. He's an American indeed, from my hometown of Chicago. But spent a lot of time overseas. As a missionary, speaks Spanish fluently. I'm sure has Italian well now that he's been here for a while. So he might be perceived as an American, but not too American. And now a Vatican insider, maybe. And also he was head of the Augustinian order. And when you're head of an international order, you've got a lot of contacts around the world too. Here's one that kind of intrigues me a bit. 12 years ago, I can tell you for sure, Cardinal Timothy Dolan was a candidate.
Really?
Oh yeah, his picture was up at all of our, and he was talked about quite a bit.
Is that just the popularity because he's well known and the name is known that they just assume, well...
I don't know, he certainly was 12 years ago. He was someone we were all taking seriously. And so I've wondered at times, well, why not this time? He's 75, but he's a pretty vigorous 75. Yes. And again, both Ratzinger and Bergoglio were older than that when they were elected Pope. Cardinal Dolan, I think, has tons of virtues, and talk about the inhabiting that public role and being able to preach the faith in a persuasive way. Big personality.
When we look at someone like Cardinal Peter Erdo in Hungary, now I know again some people have been saying that he is a possible contender, but then others are saying there's no chance because of his, because of Hungary's perception of being anti-immigrant and how he fits into that, his more traditional views. What would you think of maybe someone like that to come and take the papacy?
I think he's a very impressive figure. And one thing about Erdo, he was head of, I don't know what they call it, but the conference of all the bishops' conferences of Europe. So he's respected across the European continent. And Europe, even though the college has become much more internationalized, still 54 of the electors are from Europe. And he's someone that has a lot of support on the European continent. Also multilingual, also very good Italian, lots of Roman experience, etc. So he's a substantive figure, also about the right age. I think he's 72. So I think all that tells very much in his favor. I wouldn't count Erdo out.
If we go more north in Europe to the country of Sweden,
oh yeah,
you have Cardinal Anders Arborelius,
It's a great name.
A great name, yes. And I remember interviewing him in Stockholm before, and I was surprised by his popularity. Sweden being quite secular, a small group of Catholics, minority of Catholics, but he even was given the award Swede of the Year by the press.
He's a very impressive man. I met him, I don't think he was a cardinal yet. I think he was Archbishop of Stockholm at the Los Angeles Religious Education Congress, this big massive jamboree that happens every year. And I was speaking at it, and he was speaking at it. And there was a gathering of the bishops who were there. And I didn't know the man from Adam at that point, but we sat down before the meal and had just a great conversation. He's a Carmelite with a background in St. John of the Cross, so he's an academic, he's a mystic.
Quieter man as well.
A what?
A quieter man.
He is quiet, but kind of very sneaky smart. Like you discover, boy, this guy knows a lot about a lot of things, and very multilingual, very comfortable with English, but a variety of languages. And I was just very impressed by him. I remember that night, he wasn't a cardinal yet, now I'm pretty sure, because I thought, boy, it's too bad, because he'd make a great pope, this guy. And I still feel the same way. I think he could be one of those second-tier candidates if the left and right can't, find a victory.
Now, we just heard the bells of St. Peter's ring behind us, and last night I was asking you, were you woken up by the huge thunder and lightning storm?
No, I was.
I was 3:30 in the morning, I jumped out of bed, the whole building shook, it was incredible, and I ran to the window and it was lighting up the skies over the Vatican here. So it's an incredible moment that we're here in our history. When you look forward, are you hopeful? Are you anxious? I mean, how do you feel as someone who's not just, of course, a devout Catholic, but someone who's in the system, who's a bishop, who's got a big stake in this as well?
A combination, I would say. At the human level, I'm always a little bit nervous. I think conclave time is somewhat of a nervous time because you don't know. And the Pope is a massively important figure who will have a huge impact on the life of the Church. I think you're always a little bit nervous. Who's it going to be? At the same time, there's this serenity at the deeper level of the Holy Spirit that will never prevent the Church from, falling into non-existence. The gates of hell will not prevail against us. And so there's that kind of serene confidence in the movement of the Spirit. So it's a combination of those two things, one at the more human level, the other at a more supernatural level. But it's mysterious.
There's the Holy Spirit
as the wind is blowing. No, but it's mysterious. I always felt that.
Now, everyone keeps saying as well when I watch TV, because Pope Francis has elected 80% of these electors, that the likelihood is we're going to have a Pope who will share his vision, his style of progression and so on. Accurate or false reading?
False, in my judgment. And I think just look back at history. So famously, the conclave that elected Francis was chosen almost entirely by Benedict or John Paul II. So these conservative popes, but the conclave produced a liberal pope, let's say. And just go back through history. I think it doesn't tell very much. In a way, all bets are off. That they come together, the Pope is gone, and now it's time to do our work.
I like that. To summarize our entire conversation, after talking about everything we know, is that really we don't know anything when it comes down to it.
The answer to most questions is I don't know, but that's okay.
Finally, Bishop, you mentioned the last conclave and you looking out at the sea of iPhones across St. Peter's Square. And when I look at some of the cardinals, someone like Luis Antonio Tagle from Manila in the Philippines, an early adopter of social media, huge following on Facebook with young people, particularly in his country. Of course, your whole ministry, Word on Fire, massive across YouTube and social media. How important do you think it is for the next Pope to be plugged in and to be really present on social media? I
think it's very important. If we say, evangelization and being a strong voice for the Lord on the public's arena is key for the Pope, well, that's the way you do it today. I remember I was here for something, and it was during the Benedict Papacy, and it was like the first time they launched, I don't know what it was, Instagram or something, and it was at the audience, and they brought the little computer out to Pope Benedict, and they said, he will now initiate whatever. And you could tell, the poor man, I reverence Ratzinger. He looked so lost, like, what do you want me to do? And then they said, no, and he went like that. So, okay, that was the beginning.
That was the time,
but I think now a Pope should be a little more plugged into that world.
Yeah. The canon has just struck. It is 12
o'clock.
It has been a pleasure talking to you, Bishop Barron.
God bless
Thank
you,
you so
Colm. Thanks.
much.